What I want to do is take a time to teach you a little bit about tides. I'm really sorry that I missed you in class today. Got sidetracked, and I promise I won't do that again, or I'll try really hard anyways. I think we're all doing the best we can during this time. Okay, so I have my whiteboard here, and I'm trying to adjust my computer or my screen. Sorry, one second. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is something called a spring tide. Now, a tide, as a reminder, is the pull of the water from the moon and actually the sun. It's a gravitational pull between two different objects. So here you can see I have my sun, and I'm going to draw my earth right here. Okay, so here's my earth, right? And just a reminder, if I drew a moon right here, wherever that moon would be, the water would be pulled towards that moon. Now the question I asked you is, if this is a high tide right here, where's the other high tide? The other high tide would be on the opposite side of where the moon is, okay? And so what's going on here, this is a high tide as well. The question is, why is that a high tide? Well, there's two theories. If the moon is pulling on the earth is being pulled this direction, leaving the water behind. That's one option. The second thing is, if you take a backpack, the second idea is, if you take a backpack and you were to place it on your shoulder and spin, you'd recognize that the backpack would move away from your body. So what's the point of this, though? What am I trying to teach you? The side opposite of where the moon will experience high tide. If this is a high tide and this is a high tide, well, then these would be called a low tide, and this would also be called a low tide as well. Okay, so let's take a moment and talk about something new. Spring tide. Spring means to jump. This is a time where the water seems to get really, really high during high tides. So the water is pulled really, really, really far up the beach. Well, this happens at two moon phases. So here's my earth and here's my moon, okay? What I would do in class is I'd play a game of tug of war. I'd have two people standing in line, and they would be pulling on me. I would be the earth, somebody would be the sun, and somebody would be the moon, and we'd be pulling. Okay, in my scenario right here, when you have two sources of gravity pulling on the water, that's going to really make a huge effect on the water. This is called a tidal bulge, and I'm over-exaggerating on purpose, but my high tide would be here. My other high tide, not as big, would be here. And over here on this spot would be a low tide, and over here on this spot would be a low tide. So what is a spring tide? A spring tide occurs between a new moon or a full moon. The side facing the moon is always going to be higher tide, but this high tide is going to be so much higher. The water is going to go so much farther up the beach, and there's a huge range between a high and low tide. Visually, I can see that. Okay, so that occurs during a spring tide and a neap tide, where the sun, the moon, and the earth are all in a straight line. Okay, new, full moon, something I need you to know. The next one I want to talk to you about is a spring tide. And a spring tide, is a neap tide. Neap tide means weak. So if I have my earth here, well, this tide is going to be very weak. And when it is weak, that's because the sun and the moon are fighting at a right angle. This moon, by the way, would be a first quarter. Well, how does that affect the water? Okay, so the high tide is always going to, doing that a little bit too big. Sorry, the high tide is always going to be here. This is going to be the high tide, and these are called tidal bulges again, because the earth is spinning. Another high tide is also going to be here. My low tide is going to be here, and my other low tide is going to be here. And if I visually look at this drawing, I'm going to see that there is not much difference between my high and low. So a neap tide, there's a small difference between a high and low tide. A spring tide, again, is a big difference between high and low tides. Spring tides occur during the new moon and full moon, when the sun, moon, and earth are in a straight line. Neap tides occur when the sun, the moon, and the earth are in a 90-degree angle. So neap tides occur during a first quarter, and it also occurs during a third quarter. Play this video as many times as you need back to kind of practice with neap tides and spring tides. Sorry I missed you today. Hope that was helpful. Thank you.